Hey, this is the current yield grants interest rate observer of the air. I am Jim Grant, and with me, as always, is the great deputy editor of Grants, Evan Lorenz. And with us today, as our guest, is Mary Childs, who is the author of The Bond King, the story of Bill Gross. Hey, Evan, I went around the office the other day raving about the excellence of a news story in the Financial Times. I call it like the exemplar of the fine news story. And it was about how German car makers are stymied by the loss of Ukrainian parts. And it begins with the fact that I'm not even sure if Mary is going to know this answer, but inside every car sits almost blank or TK miles of electric cabling.
Ooh.
Now, Mary, how many miles of electric cabling will there be in a car?
Okay, no one told me that there was going to be a pop quiz. 7 miles.
You totally ruined the joke. Well, it's 3 miles, but isn't it amazing? It's not more like, I would have guessed like 15 yards. I'm a subway person myself. But,
Your framing made me think it was a lot, so I just went for
right.
it.
Yeah, somebody says, guess how long that home run was? The guy said, well, 3 miles. No, it wasn't 3 miles. It was 500 feet. So the story goes on, and it describes that for the loss of the humblest seeming part of in a car, which is a wire harness, for the loss of the wire harness that are harnesses that are manufactured in these Ukrainian plants with the most dexterous women available in Ukrainian villages and cities. For the loss of this thing, car makers can't get out of first gear because without a wire harness, you cannot thread the wires through the car, et cetera, et cetera. And this story, Evan and Mary, reminded me of the intricacy, the delicacy of market economies and how, at one point you would think that capitalism is like a field of industrial weeds and you can't kill, it's always going to come back. And then you read something like this and you realize that, of course, we also saw in the pandemic that the parts of this incredibly complex self-activated contraption are, in fact, a little bit delicate. So the date is March 16th. That's the day before, St. Patrick's Day. I want to commend German car makers hit by loss of Ukrainian parts to every single listener. That's interesting to observe. But more than that, I want to commend to our listenership of The Bond King. So Mary Childs, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. Well, Mary Childs is, as Mary, as you know, Phil well, but not every listener, is a co-host and correspondent of Planet Money. That's on NPR. And her previous tours of duty have incorporated the FT Bloomberg and Barron's. It used to be Barron's National Business and Financial Weekly. It was kind of a grandiose thing. I think got rid of it all.
Yeah.
Mary's a formidable figure in the financial journalism. And as I said, she is. So how long, Mary, did it take you to do this book?
It depends, when you start the clock, but overall it took me 7 years to do this book.
Well, Bill Gross owned like 20, right?
Yeah,
No.
exactly. So I think, he left PIMCO in the fall of 2014, and I worked for many months on a big story about what happened there. And then once that published, I was like, okay, this is it. Let's do this. And then, he kept changing the narrative. He kept doing more stuff. So yeah, it kept on rolling on.
Tell us about how you arrived in the not especially welcoming bleak regions of Newport Beach, California, without an appointment, without a contact, and you had to, in your own resourcefulness and initiative, bring up some brownies.
Yeah. So in the fall of 2014, everyone wanted to know what had happened. Everyone was, trying to figure out the real story of why Bill Gross left PIMCO so abruptly. And PIMCO wasn't talking and Bill wasn't talking. And it was just, everybody was super buttoned up. So I'm sitting there and, my sources won't talk to me. Everyone's just kind of, if they know something, they won't talk to me. And if they don't know something, they're like, I don't know, man, call somebody else. So I visited a contact in Southern California, just kind of, didn't have much to do. They're nice. We hung out, we chatted about the markets, and, they had just made some brownies. And so they gave me a little Tupperware full of brownies, just like nice people, right? So I go back to my hotel room, and I've been dreading this one thing that I have to do. Every journalist who covers a beat, if something happens on that beat, you kind of have to do this thing called doorstepping, where you go to the house of the person at the center of the maelstrom, right? Whoever the thing has just happened to, and you knock on their door you're like, hi, do you want to comment? And usually they, you get horrified looks with people being like, have you no decency? And you're like, I do not have decency. No, I don't have that. So it's not the good thing that you want to be doing, but you have to do it. I'm a beat reporter. I don't have like a whole lot of agency here. So I dutifully gather myself up and I'm like, wait, I got these brownies. It's like normal. It's normal where I come from to just take a tin of brownies to someone who's just had a tragedy happen, right? That's a normal thing to do. So I thought this was kind of a way to make it normal. It was like a loophole for me so that I didn't feel so disgusted with myself doing this. So I trucked down to Laguna and I, try to go to Bill Gross's house, which is obviously impossible because it's obviously in a gated community. And the guard is like, may I help you? And I'm like, yeah, hi, I'm here to see Bill Gross. Is he home? She's just like, I can't, what do you even? And I'm like, no, yeah, that's fair. I get that. Can I leave these brownies? And she, again, is just staring at me and blinking. Like, I don't know how to help you. Like, obviously none of these things make any sense. She's like, no, I'm not going to take these brownies for a billionaire with enemies. And I was like, okay, I completely anthrax, like, threats. I get it. I'm going to go. I'm just going to go. And I call my mom. I'm like, oh my God, what did I just do? This was so embarrassing. Told my boss that I did this, left out the brownies because, he didn't need to know about that and went about my life. And I completely forgot about this incident. I blocked it out basically. And then many, many years later, I want to say it was like 2018, I heard this rumor that had been making the rounds at PIMCO that I had shown up to Bill Gross's house to get the story wearing a Girl Scout uniform. And I'm like, oh my God, like, why would anyone think, oh no, it's the brownies. The brownies, like I did this to myself. I played myself. My like wonderful, generous way to my loophole totally backfired and created this rumor. But I also think it's indicative of the kind of culture at PIMCO. The little gossip train had gotten a little off the rails. And yeah, it was informative in the end.
Is it true they paid you $10 million not to write the book?
You should see my house, Jim. It's beautiful. No one paid me. This was the other rumor that I heard about myself, that everyone was so confused why it took me so long to write this book, which, fair, me too. But there became this sense that there must have been some dark dealing, right? That someone must have paid me off. And I actually heard that someone very high up at PIMCO had paid me $10 million. And that's why I wasn't writing and publishing the book anymore. It was dead.
So what's your price? So $10 million is not your price, right?
It didn't work. Yeah. Well, no one actually ever offered me that. So we may never know if I have a price, but someone did offer to try to broker. I think he was sincere, but
I'm thinking I would pay someone a lot of money not to write a book sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
I want to tell our listeners a little bit about some of the really good writing in this book. Mary, I so loved something that you perhaps have forgotten you wrote. That's one of the things taking a long time with the book. You wrote the phrase abruptly rich, which describes, of course, the compensation track of not a few people on Wall Street, which I thought was so much better and more arresting than suddenly. So that's what's indicative of Mary's gift with language. I want to read you a couple of sentences, ladies and gentlemen, from Mary's description of her Orange County. This won't be everyone's Orange County. So if you are from Orange County, this is just Mary's Orange County. Here it is.
Apologies.
She is talking about why anyone would go to work for PIMCO in Orange County. So, quote, why else would anyone relocate families from New York to the barren strip mall desert of Orange County for a job everyone knew was miserable? Never seeing your family again, watching as their interests withered to surfing or real estate, or plastic surgery or bar class, to combat the money boredom, the pitch black early mornings, the politicking, the disrespect, the never-ending emails from Gross and El-Erian, and on down the line. That's quite a series of phrases and sentences. And I wanted to ask you, this passage incorporates the names of two of the protagonists in this book, Bill Gross, of course, at the center, but also Mohammed El-Erian. And I'm guessing, as a fellow journo, Mary, that Mohammed gave you more access than did Bill. Because I see him quoted, and if I'm not mistaken, perhaps a little bit more favorably. But What is it about Muhammad El-Erian? Bill thought that he was an academic and a kind of a platitudinarian, and he did not deserve all these hundreds of millions of dollars. He got what? Can you give us a kind of a composite or a brief sketch of the relationship between the two, which figures importantly in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I should say that actually the inverse is true of your hypothesis there. I got almost no access to Muhammad El-Erian. He's so friendly, he's so polite, he's always in the press, but he would not talk to me for this book for years. I tried. Obviously, he's so central to the narrative that it was deeply painful as a journalist to not have access to someone just right at the core of the story. But yeah, he didn't want to talk to me, which, that's of course his prerogative. But then he somehow evidently obtained a copy of the manuscript and had a lawyer send me his notes. So he basically weighed in on the nearly final product and in that way did participate, which I was so grateful for. I was so happy to get to incorporate his thoughts. And, it's one thing to synthetically replicate someone's views and state of mind, but it's always so much better to just have them themselves weigh in, right? So that was a great relief to me, but it was really late in the game and very stressful. So to answer your actual question, the relationship between the two, I don't know. I mean, there's a question as to whether it was doomed from the start, right? Where they have such different approaches to financial markets and to communicating and to how they see the world and to how they see, effective processes. Like every single thing, I can't think of very many things where they actually agree, where their kind of overall posture is even remotely directionally the same. Bill seems to see Muhammad as this bureaucratic guy, and he wants to kind of debate, and he never says anything, and he wants to, just arrive at this consensual mush is what Bill would say. And on the flip side, I think you could say Muhammad saw Bill as, authoritarian. He'd already made up his mind. He was too harsh on people. He made all these messes because he was kind of reckless and, just kind of careening around and deciding what he wanted to do in the market and then just going and doing it despite the, broad institutional, structure around him that was supposed to make it a little more robust. So I think you can say, it's obviously up for debate, but when Muhammad El-Erian came in as, co-CEO and co-CIO, which was a deviation from PIMCO's traditional structure, I mean, it seems like the relationship and that succession plan were already doomed.
One of his investment pieces, some of them, as you said in the book, a little bit oversharing, but sometimes just refreshingly frank and self-revealing. At one point, he asks rhetorically, "Am I a great investor?" So, Mary Childs, author of The Bond King, is Bill Gross a great investor? This
is, I think, the question I get the most, and it's such an interesting one. Where, of course, there's no counterfactual. There's no world in which there was not a 40-year bull market in bonds, the wind at his back. But you can look back and see the different factors, that he says that he used and that he apparently did use. And it does seem, there was a study that came out in 2019 that I think is pretty good that showed that, yes, these factors did contribute to outperformance. And even above and beyond those factors that he used, he did deliver alpha. And I think he did identify market inefficiencies. One of the things that PIMCO did, I think, more enthusiastically and perhaps cavalierly than others is instead of holding cash, instead of, when you're required to have cash against a futures position or some derivative, they will invest that cash in cash equivalents because you're allowed to do that. It says cash and cash equivalents. That's fine. And so the definition of cash equivalents can be a little bit broad, right? So you can just get a little bit extra juice out of those, short dated corporates that are just as good as cash most of the time. And that debate, that line as to what's not actually a cash equivalent is really interesting. There's some conversation as to whether, does a Russian floater count? I don't know that it should count. Seems like right now, not really. But that's a real question. That's a real thing that people have debated. So just going that extra little tiny, reaching just a little bit further in this actually conservative part of the structure, right? This is not where you're supposed to be like gunning for anything. You're not supposed to really be pressing too hard in the cash bucket, but that's one of the places that PIMCO found they could reliably deliver just a couple extra basis points, and that adds up.
Well, Mary, which reminds me actually of our sponsor. And what would a podcast be without a word from that sponsor? So here's mine. So we are having a conference on the 18th of October in Manhattan at the Plaza Hotel. And ladies and gentlemen, you must be there. And I'm going to tell you who's going to be there besides you. Tom Hodig, the past president of the Kansas City Fed, who had the courage and persistence to resist QE when it first got started. Ed Chancellor, who will be out with a new book, The Price of Time. That's the capitalism and the curse of easy money. And that will be distributed to you gratis, ladies and gentlemen, conference comers. Christopher Bloomstrand, a fine investor, Lee Gehring, and Adam Rosenzweig, the very latest thinkers and doers on commodity markets. Zoltan Pozsar, who is the monetary thought leader at Credit Suisse, and Darren Mopan, the founder and director of Pilgrim Global, who was given grants a whole lot of good ideas, and he'll give you some too, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll see you at the Plaza Hotel on October 18th. I'm impressed by to declare an interest. Bill Gross spoke once at a grants event, and he's
good.
Very generous to grants and crediting us with certain things that he found helpful in the past. So all that's out there now. But one of the things that impresses me about his career is that he describes himself as a bear market guy. And here he was doing business he didn't get in quite at the bottom and price the top of yields, but his career was essentially one, as you said a moment ago, in the great bond bull market. And to some extent, he had to kind of overcompensate or compensate at least for his predilections. And from time to time, he would say, as in 2011, he was going to short the bond market or not get away from his index because he so disliked what the Fed was doing with regard to QE.
Yeah, it's funny. That's a great point that he did declare the end of bonds with regularity. And he's doing it now. He's out there saying if he started his career today, he wouldn't be in bonds. That's for sure. But when he started his career, he also didn't want to be in bonds. So he's sort of been an unwilling participant this whole time in the market that he low-key shaped.
The reluctant billionaire.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, I hate it. Get me out of here.
There are other characters in this most readable and enjoyable story of yours that are kind of charmers. And one of them I found was Ben Trusky.
Oh, good eye. I agree.
Self-deprecating junk bond manager. And was he the one who told you about his idea for a human resources test of applicants that you abuse as a child? If so, did you like it? Did it come from Ben?
So that did not come from Ben. I believe I heard that from someone else, and then I took it to Ben, of course, for fact checking, and he declined to comment. But it was
Ben could have said that, as fun as he is, but the substantive investment that I took away from Ben in these pages is the idea of strategic mediocrity, which is the idea never to be, isn't this kind of interesting, Evan? Never to be the best and never, of course, to be the worst. And by the way, I think that the two positions, pole position, are not unrelated. People who aspire to be the very best sometimes take risks that land right at the bottom.
Isn't there that Nordic concept of, what do they call it, the Peter principle, where the person who stands up the tallest gets whacked down?
Well, that's the life in Japan, I think.
But yeah, you've hit on one of my very favorite things in the book, where his one goal was to be the best junk bond fund manager over 10 years. He didn't want to do 1 year. He wanted 10 years. That's all he wanted. And so he ran a bunch of simulations to figure it out. And the way to do it was to stay in the top, 25, 30%, but to not gun too hard, like you're saying, not to be the best in any given year, because then you set yourself up to be the worst too. Exactly, like you're saying. And it's, he achieved his goal. He did it. He by Lipper, I think Lipper was the measure that he ended up with. He was indeed the number one junk bond fund manager over the 10-year period.
Well, I'm so glad he worked for PIMCO for the pleasure of reading about him in their book.
Yeah,
the kind of guy you want to have lunch with. Yeah. So Bill Gross had no time he was a reluctant bond billionaire, if that's a thing.
Yeah.
And yet he had no time for stocks.
Yeah, I think it's funny to think about the way he views different asset classes. And of course, everyone's opinions change over time with those markets changing. So sometimes he was like a little curious. And there's a scene in 2009 that is sort of burned into the memory of everyone who was present, where he's like, we need to be doing equities. Why aren't we in equities? Why aren't we going faster? What are you doing? And, he was right. That was, in a way, he kind of called the bottom. That was, right before the stock market bottom post-crisis, or in the crisis and into the recovery. And other times he was like, stocks are dead. Why do we even have a stocks division? What is it? So I think he had this kind of mistrust of the stock market that also shows up in junk bonds. He's also very skeptical, or was reportedly very skeptical of, why is this bid offer so wide? I don't like, they're ripping me off, make it better, like close that, get the basis points. And you're like, it's just a wider mark. Like, I don't know how to.
He said something or wrote something that you quote here. Again, we were talking to Mary Childs, the bond king, and I'm going to quote Bill Gross now, which I think is this is one of the wisest things attached to his name that I've read in your pages. Quote, "It will not be size itself that brings down this firm," says Gross. "It will be the accoutrements and trappings of size. It will be the assumed privileges of the rank and station belonging to one of the best and most successful money management firms the country has ever known. PIMCO is less likely to explode externally from the ingestion of too many assets than it is to implode internally from a self-induced ulcer."
Good writer.
Close quote. Now, well, yeah. And was that ulcer Bill Gross himself?
What a question. I think, you could definitely see that. I mean, I'm of so many minds here because I have all of my, sources in my head telling me the answer, yeah, I think some would definitely say that. I think some would say that the firm grew beyond his wheelhouse and grew beyond his comfort. And he was just uncomfortable with the amount of risk in the firm. And actually he would say that part, and wanted to rein it into things that he could really wrap his arms around. I think that, was he the ulcer? I think he dealt so poorly with that transition at the end that there is certainly an argument to make there. Yes. I think the trappings of size, it's hard to define, I think, what that means necessarily. Like, it's not that I don't think Bill was ever too entranced with the trappings of wealth, right? Like, he has a private jet, but he doesn't really travel that much. He has a lot of houses, but he's just not, he doesn't kind of flex his wealth in the same way that a lot of billionaires do, especially the ones that we know and love on Wall Street. But I think the ulcer, he certainly was pained by the size of the firm and the kind of risks that he felt he couldn't totally understand, and definitely passed that pain on to others. So I think I'm arriving at, I guess so.
Here is Mark Van Andreessen, the famed venture capitalist, reacting to something somebody said about Bill Gross's alleged improprieties. Quote, "The behavior described is completely typical of any highly successful, high-functioning organization in any field I've ever seen. High-functioning business organizations aren't Disneyland. There's always stress, conflict, argument, dissent, emotion, drama." And that's, that would be Apple, Oracle, et cetera, et cetera. What about that? Couldn't it be said that Bill Gross saw things that others didn't? He was different. He was really the face and the brain of this operation, and to some extent, other people were along for the ride, and they got rich on his eccentricities.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, I think he'd be among the first to tell you that, right? That there was this feeling that it was his firm. He made these people rich, and the dissent and the kind of what he calls the cabal of people who overthrew him for, his share of the profits. I think he would definitely say that this is a tough culture because we have to be. This company has to do well, and the way we do well is by trying real hard. What are we doing if we're just going easy on each other? And that's not how you win. We're not here to be Disneyland and be a big happy family. We're here to deliver performance. So whatever's done in the name of performance is what needs to be done. And I think that's justifiable for sure. I think there's a little bit of friction with that view and our current world. I think we're having this big renegotiation with what we expect from our employers and our employees. And that doesn't really jive well with the old PIMCO culture and what I think is still the PIMCO culture. And a lot of the culture on Wall Street, where, people are saying, this isn't working for me and I don't have to take it. I don't want to do this and you can't make me.
No. Evan, what are you going to say to this question? Is life at Grants? Does this resemble
It's
life
not
at
a
Grants?
trap. It's
Try to
totally
be as
fine.
frank as you can be.
I think the question is, if I stop making eye contact with you, Jim, will we sell more issues?
Should you try it?
I can do it for a week if you
You
want.
need a longer time horizon than that, I think. You got to do like a year to have a good sample, right?
So one of the phrases that I marked in this book as an example of Mary Childs' gift for language of the wispy-voiced one-man firing squad. Bill Gross has a kind of a anomalously, like a counter tenor. He's got a very high voice, and he speaks as if he were not an ogre. He speaks as if he were not about to turn over a table and fling a phone at you. Oh, he never did that kind of stuff, did he?
He would like a little bit slam desk drawers, I'm told, but that was more or less the extent of it. That's fine.
Yeah.
Who doesn't do that?
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. Yeah, he has a unique, I don't know, presentation overall, right? Like he's this like folksy guy on television. He shuffles his feet when he's talking to you. He's like looking down. He's kind of bashful seeming and just kind of fragile. You're like, oh, yeah, all right, guy. Like that's so. But then the flip side of that, from inside the halls of PIMCO, that little voice, inspires absolute terror in people across the trade floor and across Wall Street. The banks that, worked with PIMCO, that sold bonds to PIMCO and bought them, they also felt this kind of chill from this like kind of wispy little voice.
Yeah. Well, it's a wispy voice with a most powerful intellect. And tell us, this question I'm going to ask is a special relevance to high-performing and self-regarding founders of businesses. So Bill Gross, the founder and the irreplaceable piece of PIMCO, walks off expecting, I gather from your pages, Mary, that many of the assets would follow him, and remarkably few followed him. And did he feel did he feel a sense of betrayal that the customers were not expressing their solidarity as they ought to have for all the things that he had delivered to them? Help us understand.
Oh gosh, it was such a fraught
in his
moment.
career.
And I remember this so well at the time. I was covering it for Bloomberg News, and everyone expected this massive wave. They were saying, $30 billion at least was going to follow this guy. He's been this legendary investor for so long, and we all just waited for this tide. And it was a trickle. It was just this, I think, he got 500 million from Soros, and he got a couple other, I think Old Mutual. There were a couple other names that did follow him, but he didn't really say, he's like, oh, clients can do what they want. But knowing what he said over the many, many years and understanding his concept of loyalty, I have to think, he was kind of the kind of person who would say, I served you so well. I gave you all of this outperformance. I made you so much money. And this is how you repay me? You stick with them? Like you stay there and just take your chances with this bureaucratic thing that is nothing without me? That I think it was a really sad moment for him. I think it was both depressing to see the kind of lack of loyalty in those clients that he'd worked so hard for decades. And also like insult to injury, because he's trying to show PIMCO, he's trying to like do this big thing. Like he's like, raising his army, and the army's just not there, No,
I'm going to tell a story that I don't mean to be the commercial or the financial equivalent by any means. I was at Barron's for like 7 years, and I left in 1983 to start Grant's Interest Rate Observer. And I think Barron's had a circulation of maybe a little less than 250,000, and had that circulation for about the past 30 or 40 years. And my column, the current yield column, was reputed, according to their surveys, had like 30,000 or 40,000 or 50,000. So I figured, as my business plan, Evan, this might interest you. I figured that out of the 50,000, let us say, that probably as many as 3,000 or 4,000 would choose not to subscribe to the new Grant's Interest Rate Observer, tops. So we got together with the tax attorneys planning for the abrupt change of financial circumstances in our growing family. And as it turns out, 35 people subscribed to the first issue of Grant's. I was thinking, what are these 50,000 people thinking of? I mean, if Mary Childs comes in and takes over this seat, do you think that, well, it turns out that life goes on without key employee. It turns out And Evan, this especially it may just be that life is going to go on at Grants without the founder. I find this hard to believe myself, but it's not inconceivable.
Yeah, it's a testament to the power of institutions. It's really wild the extent to which people are loyal to the institution and weirdly not to the person sometimes. I don't know. That is really weird.
Getting back to the person for a second, I know that Gross was crowned king or bond king in 2002, but it was something that everybody really did kind of recognize for the following decade. He was kind of the voice for bonds. And since his fall, I mean, people have tried to crown Jeffrey Gundlach, but for some reason the crown just doesn't seem to stick. Why hasn't there been kind of another voice for, I guess, the bond world or a bond king since Gross was deposed?
Oh, this is such a good question. And I feel like it's like the one that I get the second most after was Bill Great at investing. And I think it might speak to, we may have like learned our lesson a little bit. We might have actually learned that star managers aren't necessarily, things that we should, a concept that we should pursue for ourselves as a society and as an investing public. I think also we've had it's more dispersed now. It's not nearly as concentrated as it was. And I think, Jeffrey Gundlach certainly has the kind of bombast and the personality and the magnetism, right? People love to hear what he has to say, and they follow his pronouncements very closely and get defensive for him. And there is, I mean, he's like a little bit of an Elon Musk of our world. But I think even so, it is hard to. We just don't do it as much anymore. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's like healthier for us to not keep crowning people and trying to make them into this, put them on this pedestal, because we may know that doesn't serve us. That sounds a bit hopeful though, doesn't it?
Well, there's another possibility, which is that, as Gross himself said in a column he wrote for the FT, I think I mentioned this in my review of your book in the journal, Mary, that since the financial crisis, and even going back to 1971, that the Fed has increasingly, since then, has been in charge of muscling around the bond market, or it's made itself in charge of muscling around the bond market and manipulating interest rates. And that at the head of the Fed sits in all his or her splendor, the bond king. So fierce is the light that beats about the throne, and uneasy is the head that wears the crown. Isn't that right, Jay Powell?
Speaking of Jay Powell for a second, he's a private equity guy. And in as much as you talked about how it's hard to separate whether, Bill Gross was clearly an intelligent, very talented trader and a very smart guy, but he also did cut his teeth during a secular bull market in bonds. But bond managers weren't the only people to benefit from the fall in interest rates. We have a whole kind of small nobility within private equity who have clearly benefited some. If we are going into a period of rising interest rates, do you see, I guess, the Bastille Day for more, well-seen, well-respected spokespeople for their industries?
Oh, I mean, first of all, I feel like we often are expecting this kind of paradigm shift, and certainly we are in one now. So maybe it is now, maybe this time is different. But I think I just feel like I'm always ready. Like, I was covering distressed debt in, what year was it? 2013 and 2014, and there was just like nothing to do, and people kept predicting a washout. They're like, we're raising funds, and like it just never came. So I'm sort of like skeptical that paradigm shifts ever quite upend as violently as we think they will. So with that said, I mean, yeah, if it is a new era, we should have, there have been so many various factors that have provided a wind at the back of all of our nobility. I think you're right. Wow, I'm just mixing they're in a boat, it's a ship, it's a sailboat. But I do think that has helped create a ton of riches and all of these bold-faced names that we care so much about and we listen to so closely. And as Bill said in his 2013 investment outlook, how tested are they really? How much, especially when you think about the rise in private markets over the decades, I'm going to buy this company, take it private, fiddle with it a little bit, make it a little more fancy in this way or that way. And there, I'm done. I did it. And there's like a genius to that sometimes. And there's just a real simple nothingness to that sometimes. And the dispersion between that hasn't been that great.
Mary, does Bill Gross like the book?
I'm thinking no. I actually have not heard from him or his people really since it came out. And I actually, if I'm thinking about the timeline, my fact checker sent him questions last summer. And, this is an exhaustive process of just making sure every single word in the book is correct and not one is out of line. And so you get a pretty good look at what is in the book. It's not all my beautiful adjectives and all the, painstaking semicolons, but it is the bones of the book. And I think that may not have been what he was hoping. I don't know what he was hoping. He never told me. He's actually quite a good subject for a journalist because he understands the process and is not really annoying about it. He gives you kind of a wide berth. He supplies interviews. He's just like actually quite nice from that perspective. But I do think that something must have happened and he decided that my book was not his book and he needed to do his own book. So I don't know. I haven't, it's only been out a couple days, so he only could have read it since Tuesday. I don't know. He's been quiet at me, at least.
Dr. Johnson said that the only evil that money can certainly fix is poverty.
Quite.
And the rest of them are there for the plucking.
That feels right.
So that 10 million, Mary, it's not going to make you happy.
I think so. I mean, I met a lot of people in the course of reporting this book who had $1 bajillion who were miserable. And I know that, it's a bit flippant that I say in the book, oh, this would make me happy. Like, of course, I would have a really fancy whatever. I would buy all the paint in the world and, that would be lovely for me. But I don't know that, it's definitely clear to me that there's some tipping point where once all your needs are met and you can put food on the table for your family, the marginal utility of the next, $10, there's a point at which it starts declining. And there's also a very high cost to these extremely toxic cultural corporate environments where you're getting money, but you're losing more.
You know what they say at Goldman Sachs, happiness can't buy you money.
That's beautiful. I'm going to get that tattooed.
Well, Mary Childs, this has been just fabulous. So glad to have you and your book.
Thank you so much.
It was glad
really
of your book to turn up for this interview too.
Say what?
I said it was good of you and your book to show up for this.
Well, I have to thank you. I really, your stamp of approval really means so much to me. Your review in the journal and this conversation, my heart is full.
Well, thank you. And it's anyway, I here I am stammering.
It's too many compliments. Sorry.
Entirely welcome. Yeah. Well, I'll nurse them later like a beer. Evan, thank you as always for being around. And in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to Current Yield, Grant's interest rate observer of the air.